Poor mom with baby helps billionaire's autistic daughter put ornaments on the Christmas tree, and what he does next is unbelievable. The freezing wind cut across Katie's face as she walked down the empty street. Sophie slept in the sling tied to her chest, protected from the cold by the only blanket they had. It was Christmas Eve, and house lights twinkled in every window. Families gathered, laughter, warmth. Katie was 27 and had been living on the streets for 3 months. She hugged Sophie tighter against her chest and kept walking. Her feet ached inside her torn sneakers. Hunger had been gnawing at her for hours, but she had managed to get some milk for the baby earlier. That was what mattered. Katie stopped in front of a huge mansion. The iron gates were tall, and the garden looked like something out of a movie. Decorated trees, golden lights everywhere, a fountain in the center. She stood there, just looking, not with envy, just with exhaustion. That's when she saw the girl. A little blonde girl was alone in the front yard, near an enormous pine tree. She was about 6, with golden hair to her shoulders and light eyes that sparkled under the lights. She wore a red velvet dress, but her face was tense, frustrated. The girl was holding a box of ornaments that seemed too heavy for her. She tried to place the box on the ground, but it toppled over, and several decorations rolled across the lawn. Silver balls, golden ones, little stars, red bows. The little girl stood still, staring at the mess. Her hands started to tremble. She knelt down and picked up a silver ball. She stood up, went to the tree, and tried to hang it on a branch. But the ornament hook wouldn't fit properly. She tried again, and again the ball fell off. The girl took a deep breath, picked up the ornament from the ground, and tried once more. Her hands were trembling more now. The ornament slipped from her fingers and rolled away. Katie watched the frustration build on the child's face. The little girl picked up another ornament, this time a golden star. She stretched her arm out, trying to reach a higher branch. She stood on her tiptoes, but she was too small. She stretched further, almost reached it. The star fell. The girl let out a low sound of frustration. She covered her ears with her hands and began to rock her body back and forth. Her eyes were squeezed shut. Katie knew that sign. She looked around. No one. The mansion was silent. Just the little girl and the enormous tree that seemed impossible to decorate alone. Katie didn't think twice. She pushed the gate, which was ajar, and entered the garden. The girl was facing away, breathing fast, still rocking. She hadn't noticed Katie approaching. "Hi," Katie said, her voice calm and soft. The little girl turned quickly, her eyes wide, frightened. She took a step back. Katie stopped where she was and smiled. "It's okay. I just came to see if you needed some help." The girl looked at Katie, then at Sophie, who was waking up in the sling. The baby had light blonde hair and curious blue eyes. Katie pointed at the tree. "I'll help you, sweetie." The little girl hesitated. She looked at the ornaments scattered on the ground, at the still bare tree, and back at Katie. "Thank you very much," she whispered, so softly that Katie barely heard her. Katie knelt down and began picking up the ornaments from the ground, putting them back in the box. The girl stood still for a moment, just watching. Then, slowly, she knelt down too and started to help. "Kai, which one do you want to put up first?" Katie asked, showing a golden ball. The girl pointed to a silver star. "Good choice. Let's go." Katie took the star and stood up. The girl stood beside her, watching. Katie hung the ornament on a branch at the right height and took a step back. "Look how beautiful it looks." The little girl tilted her head, studying it. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Katie picked up another ball, this time red, and handed it to the girl. "Want to try putting this one up?" The girl took the ornament carefully. She looked at the tree, chose a low branch, and hung it. It worked. The ornament swayed gently. The little girl's eyes lit up. "Perfect," said Katie. "You're great at this," they continued. Katie took the bigger ornaments and helped the girl choose where to put them. The little girl grew more confident. She started picking up the decorations herself, choosing the colors, deciding the spots. When she needed to reach the higher branches, the girl pointed and Katie placed it, but the rest she did herself. "This golden ball here?" the girl asked, showing a large ornament. "Perfect. It will go nicely with that silver one next to it." The little girl hung it carefully and took a step back to look. She smiled. Sophie began to stir in the sling, and Katie quickly untied it to adjust her better. The baby was fully awake and looked at everything with curious eyes. The little girl stopped decorating and approached. She looked at Sophie, fascinated. "She's small," the girl said. "She is. She's 10 months old. This is Sophie." The girl hesitantly reached out and touched the baby's chubby foot. Sophie kicked her legs and let out a little squeal of joy. The little girl giggled. It was a low sound, almost shy, but it was there. She touched Sophie's foot again, and the baby laughed too, waving her little arms. "She likes you," Katie said, smiling. The girl stayed there for another moment, playing with Sophie's tiny toes. Then she went back to the tree, more animated now. They worked together for the next few minutes. The tree took shape, gold and silver balls on the middle branches. Small stars scattered everywhere, red bows on the tips. Lights were already on the tree, and when the girl flipped the switch, everything sparkled. The little girl took a step back, her hands clasped in front of her chest. She looked at the tree, at the twinkling lights, at the gently swaying ornaments. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Katie stood next to the girl. "It's perfect. You did an amazing job." The girl looked at Katie and her smile widened. It was a huge smile, full of pure joy. "We did it together," the little girl said. Katie felt a pang in her chest. She nodded. "We certainly did." They stood there for a while longer, just looking at the illuminated tree. The girl couldn't stop smiling. She walked around the tree, looking at every ornament, every detail. "This one looks pretty," she said, pointing to a golden ball. "And this one too." Katie chuckled softly. "They all look beautiful." The little girl came back close to Katie and looked at Sophie, who was almost asleep again, snuggled against her. "Are you leaving now?" the girl asked, and her voice dropped lower. Katie felt her heart sink. She needed to go. The cold was increasing, and she still needed to find a place to spend the night with Sophie. "I have to go, sweetie." The girl lowered her head. Her fingers played with the hem of her red dress. Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, almost whispering. Katie looked at that little blonde girl with the bright eyes, at the tree they had decorated together, at the smile that had been on her face. She knelt down in front of the little girl. "Yes, I will." The girl's face lit up. She didn't say anything, but her eyes shone in a way that melted Katie's heart. "I promise," the little girl whispered. "I promise." The girl smiled again. She took a step forward and suddenly hugged Katie. It was quick, but it was there. A tight, desperate hug. Katie hugged her back, carefully, protecting Sophie between them. When the girl stepped away, she waved shyly. Katie waved back and started walking toward the gate. Sophie was quiet now, almost asleep again. Katie looked back one last time. The little girl was standing next to the illuminated tree, waving. The lights sparkled around her, and the smile was still there. Katie went out the gate and back onto the cold street, but this time she was smiling too. For the first time in months, Katie felt good, useful, important. She had helped someone, and that girl had smiled because of her. Katie walked down the street with Sophie in her arms, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something like hope. She would come back tomorrow. She had promised. Jonathan parked the car in the garage and turned off the engine. It was almost 7 in the evening and he was exhausted. Meetings all day, non-stop calls, problems to solve. All he wanted was to go inside, see Zoe, and maybe get her to eat something for dinner. He sighed and got out of the car. The nanny had left earlier today. She had warned him she had a family commitment, and Jonathan had dismissed her. Zoe would be fine alone for a few hours. She always stayed in her room anyway, drawing or playing with her toys. Jonathan entered through the side door and took off his coat. The house was silent. Normal. Zoe didn't make noise. She was quiet. She always had been. He threw the keys onto the table and walked toward the stairs. "Daddy!" Jonathan stopped. He turned around, confused. Zoe was standing at the living room door, with a huge smile on her face. She was wearing the red dress he had bought for Christmas, and her eyes were shining in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. "Zoe," he said, still processing. Zoe never ran up to him when he arrived. She always waited quietly in her room until he came up to see her. And she never called him like that, so excited. "Come look," Zoe said, waving her hand. Jonathan stood still for a second, trying to figure out what was happening. Then he walked to the living room, following his daughter. Zoe practically bounced up to the window overlooking the front yard. She pointed outside. "Look, Daddy." The tree. Jonathan looked through the window. The Christmas tree in the garden was completely decorated. Twinkling lights, gold and silver ornaments, red bows, and a shining star on top. It was perfect. He blinked, confused. You decorated the tree." Zoe nodded, excited. "Katie helped me." Jonathan frowned. "Katie? Who is Katie?" Zoe smiled even wider. "A lady. She has a tiny baby, Sophie. Her little foot is so cute, Daddy." Jonathan knelt down in front of his daughter. He was trying to understand. "Zoe, a lady came here. Today." "Yes, she helped me with the tree. I couldn't get the ornaments on. But she helped me, and the tree looks beautiful." Jonathan felt a chill down his spine. A stranger had entered the property, had talked to Zoe. But before he could say anything, Zoe continued. "She was very nice to me, Daddy. And Sophie is so small. She has little blue eyes, and I touched her foot, and she laughed." Jonathan watched his daughter. Zoe was talking fast, excited, her hands gesturing. She wouldn't stop smiling. This was strange. Zoe almost never talked that much. She was quiet, answered in monosyllables, avoided eye contact, but now she was looking directly at him, telling him everything with excitement. "Zoe, this lady, did she tell you her name?" "Katie, and the baby is Sophie. Does she live around here?" Zoe shrugged. "I don't know. But she said she's coming back tomorrow." Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. An unknown woman had appeared out of nowhere, interacted with his daughter, and now was coming back. He should be worried. He should be furious. But when he looked at Zoe, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Joy. Zoe was genuinely happy. Her eyes were sparkling. Her smile was real, and she hadn't stopped talking since he arrived. "How long ago did she leave?" Jonathan asked. "A little while ago. She said she's coming back tomorrow. She promised, Daddy." Jonathan stood up and looked out the window again. The tree was truly beautiful, every ornament in the right place, the lights shining perfectly. Whoever this Katie was, she had accomplished something Jonathan had been trying to do for years. She had made Zoe smile. "Come see it up close, Daddy," Zoe said, pulling his hand. Jonathan let his daughter guide him to the front door. They went out into the garden and the cold night air hit his face. Zoe ran to the tree and Jonathan followed her. "Look," Zoe said, pointing to a golden ball. "I put that one up, and this star here too." She showed him every ornament, explaining where she had put it, which ones Katie had helped her hang. She couldn't stop talking. Jonathan stood there, listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He just watched his daughter, so alive, so present. "She's nice, Daddy," Zoe said, looking at him. "Katie is very nice." Jonathan nodded slowly. "She seems to be..." Zoe was silent for a moment, looking at the tree. Then she said, softly, "She's coming back tomorrow. She promised." Jonathan felt something churn inside him. Zoe was counting on it. She wanted this Katie to return. What if she didn't? What if it was just a fleeting moment? He didn't want to see his daughter disappointed, But at the same time, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Zoe was different, more open, happier. "Okay," Jonathan said, putting his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "If she promised, then she'll be back." Zoe smiled and hugged his leg. It was quick, but it was there. A spontaneous hug. Jonathan froze. Zoe didn't do that. She didn't like physical touch, avoided hugs, got tense when someone got too close, but now she was hugging him, unforced, without hesitation. He placed his hand on her head, gently. "Shall we go inside? It's cold out here." Zoe let go of him and nodded. They went back inside, and Zoe went straight to the living room. She sat on the sofa, still smiling, and started swinging her legs. Jonathan stood in the doorway, just watching. Who was this Katie? He knew nothing about her. He didn't know where she had come from, why she had helped Zoe, or why she had promised to come back. But she had done something no one else had been able to. She had connected with Zoe. Jonathan looked at the tree through the window. It shone in the dark garden, perfect and full of life. He thought about his daughter, so excited, so unlike her usual self. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt something like hope. Maybe this Katie, whoever she was, could be exactly what Zoe needed. He didn't know, but he would find out tomorrow. When she returned. If she returned. Katie walked 3 blocks until she reached the town square. Sophie was asleep again, nestled against her chest. Night had fallen completely and the cold was worse. She stopped near a grocery store. A few people went in and out with full shopping bags. Katie took a deep breath and positioned herself near the door. "Excuse me," she said to a man in a suit. "Do you have any change? I need to buy milk for my baby." The man didn't even look at her. He walked right past. Katie tried again. "Please, ma'am." "Just some change." The woman clutched her purse closer to her body and quickened her pace. Katie closed her eyes for a second. She hated doing this. She hated asking, but she had no choice. Sophie needed milk. "Miss." Katie opened her eyes. An elderly lady was standing in front of her, holding a shopping bag. "Here," the lady said, holding out some coins. "Thus, buy the little one her milk." Katie felt her eyes sting. "Thank you so much. Seriously, thank you very much." The lady smiled and went on her way. Katie counted the coins. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a small carton of milk, maybe 2 if she was lucky. She entered the supermarket and went straight to the milk section. She grabbed 2 small cartons and went to the checkout. The woman who served her looked at Katie suspiciously, but scanned the products and took the money without saying anything. Katie left the store with the cartons in her old backpack. At least Sophie wouldn't go hungry tonight. She walked to a bench in the square and sat down. Sophie started whimpering, and Katie knew what it was. Hunger. She took the bottle out of her backpack and opened one of the milk cartons. She poured the white liquid into the bottle and closed it. The milk was cold. Sophie wouldn't be able to drink it like that. Katie held the bottle between her hands and started rubbing, trying to warm it up. Her hands were trembling with cold, and she squeezed them tighter around the bottle, blowing on it lightly. It took a few minutes, but the milk became less cold. Katie shook the bottle and tested it on her wrist. It was lukewarm. Not ideal, but it would do. She untied the sling and adjusted Sophie onto her lap. The baby opened her blue eyes, still whimpering. Katie put the bottle in her mouth, and Sophie started sucking eagerly. "Slow down, honey, take it easy." Katie watched Sophie drink the milk. The baby's blonde hair was messy, her cheeks red from the cold, but she was eating. That was what mattered. When Sophie finished, Katie put the bottle back in her backpack. She looked around the square. It was empty. Only a few homeless people scattered on the benches. Katie's stomach rumbled. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and even then it was just a piece of stale bread someone had thrown away. She needed to eat something. She couldn't run out of energy, or she wouldn't be able to take care of Sophie. Katie put the baby back in the sling and stood up. She knew of a bakery a few streets away. Sometimes they threw away stale bread in the trash at the end of the day. She walked there, with Sophie sleeping heavily against her chest. When she arrived, the bakery was already closed. Katie went to the back, where the dumpsters were. There was a trash bag next to the dumpster. Katie carefully opened it and looked inside. Hard rolls, some pieces of dry cake, a tray of old savory snacks. She grabbed 2 rolls and a piece of cake. It wasn't moldy, it was edible. Katie put the food in her backpack and walked away before anyone saw. She hated this. She hated looking for food in the trash, but it was all they had. The cold was unbearable now. Katie needed to find a place to sleep, a covered place, protected from the wind. She walked 2 more streets until she reached a closed store. It had a large awning in front, and the space underneath was empty. Katie sat down on the ground and leaned against the wall. Sophie was warm against her chest, sleeping deeply. Katie took the blanket out of her backpack and covered the baby carefully, adjusting it so the cold wouldn't get through. She took one of the rolls and bit into it. It was hard, dry, difficult to chew, but it satisfied her hunger. Katie ate slowly, looking at the empty street. A few cars passed by, people returning home, to their families, to warmth. She finished the roll and put the rest of the food away. She needed to save it for tomorrow. Katie adjusted herself better, resting her head against the wall. Sophie was safe in her arms, protected from the cold by the blanket and Katie's body. She closed her eyes, but couldn't sleep. The ground was hard, the cold seeped through her clothes, and the wind blew under the awning. Katie hugged Sophie tighter and kissed the baby's blonde head. "It's going to be all right, my love," she whispered. "I promise." Meanwhile, miles away, Zoe was lying in the king-size bed in her room. The comforter was thick and warm, the pillows soft. The heater kept the room at a perfect temperature. She was wearing soft, comfortable flannel pajamas. The room was dark, but the hallway light entered through the slightly open door. Zoe was holding a teddy bear and looking at the ceiling. She was thinking about Katie, her smile, Sophie, so small and cute. She wished tomorrow would come soon. She wanted Katie to come back. Jonathan came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Still awake, sweetie?" Zoe turned her head towards him and nodded. "I can't sleep." "Why?" "I'm thinking about Katie and Sophie." Jonathan ran his hand through his daughter's blonde hair. "They'll be back tomorrow. Do you think so?" "I think so." Zoe smiled. She hugged the teddy bear tighter and closed her eyes. Jonathan stayed there for a few more minutes until he was sure she was asleep. Then he got up, turned off the hallway light, and went to his own room. Zoe slept peacefully, warm and safe. Katie didn't sleep. She stayed awake all night, protecting Sophie from the cold, adjusting the blanket whenever the wind blew, kissing the baby's forehead to make sure she was all right. Her body ached, her stomach rumbled, her feet were numb from the cold. But Sophie was safe. She was warm, she was sleeping, and Katie would endure. She always did. When the sun began to rise, Katie finally closed her eyes for a few minutes. But she soon woke up again because Sophie had started crying. She grabbed the bottle, prepared the milk, and fed the baby. Then she cleaned Sophie with old wet wipes she had saved, changed her diaper and adjusted her clothes. Katie looked at the sky. The day was beginning. She had promised to return, and she was going to keep her promise. Katie arrived in front of the mansion around 10 in the morning. Sophie was awake in the sling, looking at everything with curiosity. Katie had washed her face in a public fountain and tried to tidy her hair, but she knew she looked tired. She hadn't slept well. Her body ached, but she had made a promise. Katie stopped in front of the gate and took a deep breath. Was the girl waiting? Did she really want Katie to come back? Before she could think any further, she heard a shout. "Katie!" Katie looked up and saw Zoe running across the garden. The little girl had a huge smile on her face, her blonde hair flying back. She was wearing a blue dress today, and her bright eyes were shining. Zoe reached the gate and pushed it open. She ran to Katie and hugged her around the waist, squeezing tightly. Katie was speechless for a second. Then she put her hand on the girl's head, returning the hug. "Hi, sweetie. You came back. You promised and you came back?" Katie smiled. "So of course, I came back." Zoe let go of Katie and looked at Sophie, who was staring at her with curious blue eyes. "Hi, Sophie," Zoe said, waving at the baby. Sophie gave a toothless grin, and Zoe giggled. "Daddy!" Zoe shouted, turning towards the house. "She's back! Katie's back!" Katie looked up and saw a man coming out the front door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair was dark, and he had a serious expression on his face. Katie swallowed hard. This must be the girl's father. Jonathan walked towards them, observing Katie carefully. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look exactly happy either. "So you're Katie," he said, stopping a few feet away. Katie nodded. "Yes, sir." "Jonathan," he said, extending his hand. Katie shook his hand quickly. Jonathan's hand was warm and firm. Hers was cold and trembling. Jonathan looked at his daughter, who was clinging to Katie, smiling. He saw the way Zoe held Katie's hand, the way she looked at Sophie. Something in his expression changed. It became softer. "Zoe hasn't stopped talking about you since yesterday," Jonathan said. Katie smiled, embarrassed. "She helped me a lot with the tree," Zoe said, "and Sophie is so cute, Daddy." Jonathan looked at the baby in the sling. Sophie had light blonde hair, rosy cheeks, and huge blue eyes. She looked at Jonathan and gave a little smile. "She's beautiful," Jonathan said. Then he looked back at Katie. "Would you like to come in, have some coffee?" Katie hesitated. She didn't want to intrude, but Zoe was already pulling her hand. "Come on, Katie, come in." Katie let the girl guide her into the house. Jonathan followed them, observing everything in silence. They entered through the front door, and Katie was impressed. The house was enormous, high ceilings, expensive furniture, everything clean and organized. It smelled of fresh coffee. "Sit down," Jonathan said, pointing to the large sofa in the living room. Katie sat on the edge, still holding Sophie. Zoe sat next to her, close, as if afraid Katie would disappear. Jonathan went to the kitchen and returned with a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. He placed them on the coffee table. "Make yourself comfortable." Katie looked at the coffee, and her stomach rumbled. She hadn't had real coffee in months. But she took the cup carefully, sipping slowly. It was hot, delicious. She almost sighed with relief. Jonathan sat in the armchair across from her and crossed his arms, watching. "Zoe told me you helped her with the tree." Katie nodded. "She was trying to do it alone. I just helped." "Do you live around here?" Jonathan asked, casually. Katie froze. She lowered her eyes to the coffee cup. Zoe was looking at her, waiting for the answer. Katie hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she was also ashamed to tell the truth. Jonathan noticed. He leaned forward. "Katie, where do you live?" Katie squeezed the cup between her hands. She felt her eyes sting, but held back the tears. "We're living on the streets," she said softly. Silence fell in the room. Jonathan stayed still, processing. He looked at Katie, then at Sophie, and back at Katie. "On the streets," he repeated, as if he hadn't understood. Katie nodded, unable to look at him. "How long?" 3 months. Jonathan ran his hand over his face. He looked shocked, and also sad. "Do you have family? Anyone who can help?" Katie shook her head. "I don't have anyone. Just Sophie." Zoe, who had been silent until now, held Katie's hand tightly. Katie looked at her and saw tears in the girl's eyes. "You can't leave," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "You can't." Katie felt a tightness in her chest. She stroked the girl's blonde hair. "It's okay, sweetie." "No, it's not," Zoe said, louder now. "You can't live on the street." "You can't." Jonathan stood up and started pacing the room. He was thinking, processing. Katie could see his mind working. He stopped and looked at Katie. "Do you have experience with children?" Katie blinked, confused by the change of subject. I do. I used to work at a daycare before everything. And with autistic children. Katie hesitated. Not professionally, but I studied about it in college, education. Jonathan nodded as if making a decision. Zoe hardly ever interacts with anyone, he said, looking at his daughter. But with you, she smiles, she talks, she hugs. Zoe was still holding Katie's hand, squeezing tightly, as if afraid to lose her. Jonathan took a deep breath. I want to hire you as Zoe's nanny. Katie's eyes widened. What? You would take care of her during the day. I work a lot, and the nanny I have now, she doesn't connect with her. Not the way you connected. Katie didn't know what to say. She looked at Zoe, whose eyes were shining with hope. But I have nowhere to live, Katie said, her voice cracking. Jonathan took a step forward. You two can live here. Katie felt the tears spill over. She wiped them quickly, but it didn't help. They kept falling. Sir, Jonathan, call me Jonathan. Jonathan, I can't accept this. It's too much. You would be working, he said firmly. It's not charity, it's a job. You would take care of Zoe, and in return, you would have a place to live, food and a salary. Katie looked at Sophie, who was looking at her with those innocent blue eyes. She looked at Zoe, who continued to hold her hand, silently pleading for her to stay. Katie couldn't speak. The tears wouldn't stop falling. Please, Zoe said, softly. Stay with us. That broke Katie. She sobbed and covered her face with her free hand. Jonathan approached and knelt down in front of her. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. For you, for Sophie. Katie raised her face and looked at him. Jonathan's eyes were also shining, emotional. I accept, Katie said, her voice broken. I accept. Zoe let out a little squeal of joy and hugged Katie tightly. Sophie, in the middle of it all, started clapping her hands, laughing. Jonathan placed his hand on Katie's shoulder, squeezing lightly. Welcome, he said, his voice husky. Katie was crying non-stop now. She hugged Zoe back, kissed Sophie's head, and looked at Jonathan with gratitude. For the first time in months, Katie felt like everything was going to be okay. She had a roof over her head. She had food. She had a job. And most importantly, she had people who cared. Zoe wouldn't let go of Katie, and Katie didn't want her to. The three of them stayed there, hugging, while Jonathan watched with a small smile on his face. That house had been silent for so long, but now it was full of life, and it had all started with a Christmas tree. Before Katie arrived, Zoe's routine was always the same. She would wake up, eat breakfast alone in the kitchen while Jonathan got ready for work. Then she would go up to her room and stay there. The old nanny would knock on the door sometimes, offer lunch, try to talk. Zoe would answer in monosyllables and go back to her drawings. She spent hours drawing, always in her room, always alone. She drew trees, houses, animals, never people. And she never showed her drawings to anyone. When Jonathan arrived in the evening, she was in the same spot, sitting on the floor with colored pencils scattered around her, drawing in silence. She didn't like to be touched. She didn't like noise. She didn't like change. Her world was small, controlled, safe, but lonely. Jonathan knew this. He watched his daughter close herself off more and more, and he didn't know how to help. All the nannies he hired gave up after a few weeks. Zoe wouldn't interact, wouldn't respond, wouldn't open up, until Katie arrived. In the first week with Katie, things began to change. On the first day after Jonathan left for work, Katie stayed in the living room with Sophie. She had put the baby on the rug with some toys and was sitting beside her, playing with her. Zoe was in her room as usual. Katie didn't push. She left Zoe's bedroom door ajar and continued playing with Sophie, talking to the baby, laughing when Sophie tried to grab a rattle. After half an hour, Katie heard light footsteps in the hallway. She looked up and saw Zoe standing at the living room door, watching. The girl didn't come in, she just stood there watching Katie and Sophie play. Katie smiled at her, but didn't say anything. Didn't call her over, just kept playing. Zoe stayed there for a few minutes, then she went back to her room. But the next day, she came back. And this time she stayed longer. On the third day, Zoe entered the living room. Katie was singing a little song to Sophie, shaking a rattle. Zoe walked slowly to the rug and sat down at a distance, still observing. Katie continued singing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sophie clapped her hands, and Katie laughed. Zoe didn't say anything. She just watched. But she was there, out of her room, in the living room. Katie knew that was huge. On the fourth day, Zoe brought her colored pencils. She came into the living room, sat on the sofa and started drawing. Katie was on the rug with Sophie, but she looked at Zoe and smiled. "That's great. What are you drawing?" Zoe didn't answer, but she also didn't run away. Katie went back to playing with Sophie, and Zoe continued drawing. The room was silent, but it was a comfortable silence. After a while, Zoe held up the drawing and looked at Katie. It was a Christmas tree, full of colorful ornaments. "That looks beautiful," Katie said. "Just like ours." Zoe smiled. A small smile, but it was there. In the second week, Zoe started following Katie around the house. Katie would go to the kitchen to prepare Sophie's bottle, and Zoe would follow. She didn't talk, didn't help. She just stood there watching. Katie explained what she was doing, even without knowing if Zoe was paying attention. "I'm going to warm up Sophie's milk. She likes it lukewarm." Zoe watched Katie test the temperature on her wrist, fill the bottle, close the cap. When Katie went to the living room, Zoe followed. When Katie went upstairs to change Sophie, Zoe went up too and stood at the bedroom door watching. Katie never told her to leave, never asked why she was following. She just kept doing what she needed to do, always explaining, always calmly. And Zoe kept following. It was in the third week that Zoe started to imitate. Katie was sitting on the rug, rocking Sophie, humming softly. Zoe was sitting on the sofa, drawing as always. Sophie started whimpering, and Katie took a cloth and carefully wiped the baby's mouth. "There you go, sweetheart. It's all right." Katie looked up and saw Zoe watching. The girl had stopped drawing and was looking at the scene intently. The next day, when Sophie whimpered, Zoe got up from the sofa and grabbed the cloth before Katie did. She held it out to Katie without saying anything. Katie took the cloth and smiled. "Thank you, Zoe. That's very thoughtful of you." Zoe went back to the sofa, but Katie saw the little smile on her face. From that day on, Zoe started to help. She brought the bottle when Katie asked. She brought the diaper. She held the rattle for Sophie. She was participating. In the fourth week, Zoe started playing on the rug. Katie was playing with Sophie, stacking colored blocks. The baby knocked them down, and Katie built them up again, laughing. Zoe was on the sofa, but her eyes were glued to the game. "Want to play with us?" Katie asked, casually. Zoe hesitated. She looked at the blocks, then at Sophie, then back at Katie. Katie didn't insist. She went back to stacking the blocks. A few minutes later, Zoe got off the sofa and sat on the floor, at a safe distance. She didn't touch the blocks, she just watched. But she was there, on the rug, close. The next day, she sat closer, and the day after that, she picked up a block. Katie didn't make a fuss. She just smiled and kept playing. Sophie clapped her hands when she saw Zoe with the block, and Zoe placed it on top of the tower Katie was building. The tower fell, and Sophie burst out laughing. Zoe laughed too. It was the first time Katie had heard Zoe truly laugh. A low, shy laugh, but real. In the fifth week, Zoe started approaching spontaneously. Katie was bottle feeding Sophie on the sofa. Zoe was drawing on the rug. Suddenly, she got up and walked to Katie. She didn't say anything. She just sat down next to her, very close, and watched Sophie drink the milk. Katie didn't move, didn't speak. She just kept feeding the baby, letting Zoe stay there, close. After Sophie finished, Zoe reached out and touched the baby's foot, just like she had on the first day. Sophie kicked her legs and smiled. Zoe smiled back. "She likes you," Katie said softly. "I like her too," Zoe replied. It was the first time Zoe had said something without being asked. Katie felt a surge of emotion in her chest, but didn't show it. She just smiled and nodded. When Jonathan arrived from work, he saw the difference. Zoe was no longer locked in her room. She was in the living room, playing on the rug with Katie and Sophie, or drawing on the sofa while Katie sang to the baby, or sitting next to Katie just watching. She smiled more, talked more, was more present. Jonathan saw all this and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. His daughter was opening up. Slowly, carefully, but she was. And it was all because of Katie and little Sophie, who with her toothless grin had won Zoe's heart. The house was no longer silent. There was laughter, there were conversations, there was life. And Zoe, for the first time in years, seemed happy. The storm started suddenly. Katie was in the living room with Sophie in her arms when she heard the first clap of thunder. It was loud, booming, and made the windows shake. Sophie was startled and started whimpering. Katie rocked her, whispering reassuring words. Zoe was drawing on the rug. When the thunder roared, she dropped her pencil and covered her ears with her hands. Katie looked at her, worried. "It's all right, Zoe. It's just a storm." But another clap of thunder came, louder than the first. Rain started falling heavily, beating against the windows. The wind howled outside. Zoe started rocking her body back and forth, still with her hands over her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Zoe!" Katie called, standing up. But before she could approach, lightning flashed across the sky, followed by deafening thunder. Zoe screamed. She jumped up too quickly, tripped over her pencils and fell to her knees. She started crying, loudly, desperately. Her hands squeezed her ears tightly, and she rocked her body violently. Katie put Sophie in the portable crib in the living room and went to Zoe. "Zoe, sweetie, I'm here." But Zoe wasn't listening. She was in a panic. She stood up and ran, aimlessly, just wanting to escape the noise. That's when Jonathan walked in the front door, soaking wet. He had come home early from work because of the storm. "Zoe!" he yelled when he saw his daughter running across the room, having a meltdown. He dropped his briefcase and went to her. He tried to hold her by the shoulders. "Zoe, calm down. It's me, Daddy." But Zoe struggled. She didn't want to be touched. She was in complete sensory overload. The noise of the storm, the rain beating on the windows, the wind, the flickering lights, it was too much. Zoe broke free from Jonathan and ran to the dining table. She threw herself onto the floor and squeezed under the table, curling up in a fetal position. She cried loudly, sobbing, her hands still covering her ears. Jonathan crouched down, trying to reach her. "Zoe, please, come out. Daddy will help you." But Zoe screamed louder. She didn't want help, didn't want contact. She just wanted everything to stop. Jonathan tried again, reaching out his hand. Zoe curled up even tighter, turning her face away. He backed off, not knowing what to do. His hands were trembling, and Katie saw the frustration on his face, and the pain. Katie approached slowly and touched Jonathan's shoulder. "Let me try," she said softly. Jonathan looked at her, lost, and nodded. He stepped away, standing a few feet back, watching. Katie knelt on the floor, near the table, but not underneath. She stayed where Zoe could see her if she wanted, but without invading the girl's space. Zoe," Katie said in a low, calm voice. "I'm here." Zoe continued crying, but Katie saw that she had opened one eye, slightly. Katie didn't move. She just stayed there, sitting on the floor, breathing slowly. "I know it's noisy," Katie said. "I know it's scary, but you are safe." Another clap of thunder boomed outside, and Zoe curled up even tighter, sobbing. Katie waited for the noise to pass. Then she continued in the same calm voice. "The noise can't hurt you. I promise you are inside, protected." Katie started breathing very audibly, very slowly, inhaling through her nose, exhaling through her mouth, a steady rhythm. Zoe was still crying, but Katie noticed that she had started paying attention to the breathing. Katie continued. Inhale, exhale slowly. After a few minutes, Zoe's crying started to subside. She was still sobbing, but she was calmer. That's it, Katie said gently. Breathe with me, slowly. Zoe tried. She inhaled shakily, exhaled in sobs. Katie didn't stop. She continued breathing, showing the rhythm. After a few more minutes, Zoe started following. Her breathing calmed down, becoming more regular. Very good, sweetie, Katie said. You're doing so well. Zoe finally took her hands away from her ears. Her face was red, wet with tears. She looked at Katie, still frightened. Katie reached out her hand slowly, placing it in front of Zoe. She didn't touch her, she just offered it. Do you want to come out from under the table? I'll help you. Zoe looked at Katie's hand. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. Katie held Zoe's small, warm hand and helped her crawl out from under the table. Zoe was trembling, her whole body tense. Katie didn't rush her. She just stood there, holding the girl's hand, waiting. Then Zoe took a step forward and threw herself into Katie's arms. Katie hugged her instantly, squeezing tightly but gently. Zoe buried her face in Katie's shoulder and started crying again. But it was different now. It wasn't panic. It was relief. It's all right, Katie whispered, stroking Zoe's blonde hair. Sis, it's all right now. Zoe clung to Katie as if she were drowning, and Katie was the only thing keeping her alive. Her fingers squeezed Katie's shirt, and she wouldn't let go. Katie kept hugging her, rocking gently, whispering soothing words. The storm continued outside, but Zoe was no longer paying attention. She was focused on Katie, her voice, her scent, the safety she offered. Jonathan stood still, watching everything. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching his daughter calm down in someone else's arms, in the arms of someone who had achieved what he never could. Katie stayed there with Zoe for long minutes. When she felt the girl was calmer, she pulled back slightly and looked at her face. You were very brave, Katie said, wiping the tears from Zoe's face. Very brave, Zoe nodded, still shaking a little. Katie stood up, holding Zoe's hand, and the two went to the sofa. They sat together and Zoe leaned against Katie, exhausted. Jonathan still stood, unsure of what to do. Katie looked at him and gestured for him to come closer. Jonathan walked slowly to the sofa and sat in the armchair beside them. He looked at Zoe, who was resting her eyes, leaning against Katie. How did you do that? He asked, his voice hoarse. Katie looked at him. Sensory technique. She was in overload. She needed calm, rhythm, safety. Jonathan ran his hand over his face and wiping away the tears. I tried, he said, his voice breaking. I tried to help, but she wouldn't let me. You tried the way you knew how, Katie said softly. It's not your fault. Jonathan shook his head, collapsing. I often don't know how to deal with my daughter. I feel like I'm not enough. The words came out of him like a confession, like something that had been bottled up for a long time. Katie reached out her free hand and held Jonathan's hand. He looked at her, surprised. You have never failed, Katie said firmly. You have always been here. Jonathan looked at Katie's hand, holding his. Then he looked at Zoe, who was sleeping on Katie's shoulder. But I don't know how to make her feel safe like you did. Katie squeezed his hand. Then let me teach you. Jonathan looked up. You would do that? Of course, Katie said, smiling. You're her father, you deserve to know. Jonathan nodded, emotional. Please, I want to learn. I need to learn. In the following days, Katie started teaching Jonathan. She explained about sensory overload, how Zoe's brain processed stimuli differently, how loud noises, flashing lights, too much touch could be too much for her. When she's having a meltdown, don't try to hold her tightly, Katie explained. That only makes it worse. Offer presence, but don't invade. Jonathan listened to everything, absorbing every word. Katie showed him breathing techniques, how to create a rhythm that Zoe could follow, how to use a low, calm, steady voice. And always let her know she is safe. Repeat it. She needs to hear it. Jonathan practiced. Katie simulated situations, and he tried to apply what he had learned. Katie also taught him about communication. Zoe doesn't like direct eye contact. Don't force it. Stand next to her, not in front of her, and use simple, direct words. Jonathan nodded, mentally noting every detail. And she likes predictability, Katie continued. Routines help. Warn her before doing something different. Prepare her. Jonathan was absorbing everything like a sponge. A few days later, Zoe was drawing in the living room. Jonathan came home from work and, instead of just waving and going upstairs to change, he sat down next to her, not in front, beside. "Hi, Zoe," he said in a calm voice. Zoe looked at him from the corner of her eye. "Hi, Daddy." Jonathan looked at her drawing. It was a house with a tree in the garden. "That looks beautiful," he said. Zoe didn't answer, but she smiled a little. Jonathan stayed there in silence, just watching her draw. He didn't ask anything, he didn't touch her. He just stayed present. After a few minutes, Zoe picked up a blue pencil and held it out to him. "You can color the sky," she said softly. Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. He took the pencil carefully and started coloring the sky of her drawing. They stayed there, side by side, coloring together. Katie watched from the kitchen with Sophie in her arms and smiled. Days later, Katie proposed a game. "Shall we build a tower?" she asked, picking up the blocks. Zoe nodded and sat on the rug. Jonathan was on the sofa, watching. "You too, Jonathan," Katie said, beckoning him over. Jonathan hesitated, but came down and sat on the rug on the other side of Zoe. Katie started stacking the blocks. Zoe placed one on top. Jonathan picked up another one and looked at Zoe, waiting. Zoe pointed to where he should place it. Jonathan placed it. They continued, building the tower together. Katie mediated, giving gentle instructions, maintaining the rhythm. The tower grew. It was tall, unstable. "Careful," Katie said. "Now the next one will knock it down." Zoe took a small block and placed it on top. Slowly, the tower stood. The three of them let out an exclamation of relief and laughed. Zoe clapped her hands, excited. She looked at her father, and Jonathan saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. Connection. That's when it happened. Zoe reached out and touched Jonathan's hand. It was quick, just a touch, but it was voluntary. Jonathan froze. He looked at his daughter, too emotional to speak. Zoe smiled at him, a small smile, but real. Jonathan felt tears well up, but held them back. He turned his hand, slowly, and left his palm open. Zoe looked at his hand. Then, slowly, she placed her small hand on top. Her fingers were small, warm. She didn't squeeze. She just left it there, touching. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't want to scare her away. He just stood there, feeling his daughter's hand on his, and it was the most precious moment of his life. Katie watched everything with tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything. She just let father and daughter have that moment. After a few seconds, Zoe removed her hand and went back to playing with the blocks, as if nothing had happened. But it had happened. Jonathan quickly wiped his eyes and continued playing, but his heart was bursting with emotion. That night, after Zoe went to sleep, Jonathan and Katie stayed in the living room. "Thank you," Jonathan said, looking at Katie. "For everything." Katie smiled. "You're learning fast. I feel like I'm really getting to know my daughter for the first time." Katie nodded. "She was always there. You just needed to learn her language." Jonathan looked at his hands. "She touched me today. Voluntarily. I saw That had never happened, he said, his voice cracking. Never. Katie approached and put her hand on his shoulder. It will happen more often. You'll see. Jonathan looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt real hope. His daughter was getting closer to him, and he had Katie to thank. The weeks passed, and Zoe was becoming more and more relaxed. She no longer stayed isolated in her room. She spent the whole day in the living room, near Katie and Sophie, and the more time she spent with the baby, the more enchanted she became. Sophie had become the center of Zoe's world. It started with small gestures. Zoe watched Katie care for the baby, and little by little started wanting to help. "Can I hold the rattle?" Zoe asked one day, when Sophie was on the rug. Katie smiled. "Of course." Zoe picked up the pink rattle and sat near Sophie. She shook it gently, and the soft sound made Sophie turn her head. The baby's blue eyes widened, curious. She looked at Zoe and smiled. Zoe shook it again. Sophie let out a little giggle. "She liked it," Zoe said, excited. "She sure did," Katie agreed. "You're very good with her." Zoe continued shaking the rattle, and Sophie clapped her little hands, trying to grab it. The two of them stayed there, playing, and Katie watched with a warm heart. From that day on, Zoe always wanted to play with Sophie. A few days later, Katie was preparing the bottle in the kitchen. Sophie was in the stroller in the living room, starting to whimper. Zoe was drawing on the sofa, but when she heard Sophie, she got up immediately. "Katie, Sophie is crying." "I'm coming, sweetie." But Zoe didn't wait. She went to the stroller and started rocking it, slowly, the way she had seen Katie do. "Shh, Sophie. Katie is coming. It's all right." Sophie stopped whimpering and looked at Zoe. The girl continued rocking the stroller, carefully, maintaining a gentle rhythm. When Katie arrived with the bottle, Sophie was quiet, just looking at Zoe. "You calmed her down," Katie said, impressed. Zoe smiled, proud. "I did it like you do." Katie felt her eyes sting with emotion. "You're a great helper, Zoe." From that moment on, Zoe started helping more. She brought the diaper when Katie asked. She brought the cloth when Sophie drooled. She held toys for the baby. She was taking care of Sophie. And she loved every second of it. One afternoon, Zoe was drawing while Katie fed Sophie. When she finished, Zoe held up the drawing. "Look what I did." Katie looked. It was a drawing of a blonde girl with a baby on her lap. They were both smiling. "Is that you and Sophie?" Katie asked. Zoe nodded, excited. "It is. I drew us." Katie felt a tightness in her chest. "It's beautiful, Zoe, very beautiful." Zoe ran to Sophie and showed the drawing to the baby. "Look, Sophie, it's me and you." Sophie looked at the drawing and giggled, kicking her little legs. Zoe laughed too and hugged the paper to her chest. "I'm going to keep it in my room," she said. "It's special." Katie watched Zoe run up the stairs, and a tear rolled down her face. That girl who used to not interact with anyone was now drawing portraits and creating bonds, all because of a little blue-eyed baby. In the following days, Zoe wouldn't stop drawing for Sophie. She drew flowers, animals, stars, hearts. Every drawing was a gift for the baby. Katie taped some to the wall of Sophie's room, and Zoe spent hours looking at them, happy. "When Sophie grows up, she'll know I made this for her," Zoe said one day. "She will," Katie replied, "and she will love it." Zoe smiled and went back to drawing. One morning, Katie was in the living room playing with Sophie on the rug. The baby had just learned to sit up by herself and was very proud, rocking her body. Zoe ran down, still in her pajamas. "Can I play with you?" "Always," Katie said, making room. Zoe sat down next to Sophie and started making faces. The baby looked at her, curious. Zoe made another face, opening her mouth wide. Sophie burst out laughing. Zoe did it again, this time pulling her cheeks. Sophie laughed louder, hitting her little hands on the floor. "She thinks it's funny," Zoe said, laughing too. Katie watched the two of them playing, and her heart was so full it felt like it would burst. Zoe kept making faces, and Sophie wouldn't stop laughing. The sound of the baby's giggles filled the room, and Zoe was radiant. "I make her laugh. Katie, I can do it." "Yes, you can, sweetie. You are very special to Sophie." Zoe stopped and looked at the baby. Sophie was looking back, with that silly baby look, drooling a little. Zoe reached out and touched Sophie's plump cheek. "She's so tiny," Zoe said, softly. "Jason, and so cute." Sophie grabbed Zoe's finger and squeezed with her little hand. Zoe stood still, looking at her finger, held in the baby's hand. "She's holding my finger," Zoe whispered, emotional. "She is," Katie said. "She likes you." Zoe stayed there, unmoving, letting Sophie hold her finger. She had a huge smile on her face. In the afternoon, Jonathan came home early from work. He walked into the living room and saw a scene that made him stop. Zoe was sitting on the floor, with Sophie on her lap. Katie was beside them, supervising, but it was Zoe who was caring for the baby. She held Sophie gently, rocking her lightly, humming a little tune she had learned from Katie. Sophie was quiet, looking at Zoe with her bright blue eyes. Jonathan stood in the doorway, just watching. He didn't want to interrupt. Katie noticed his presence and smiled, gesturing for him to be quiet. Zoe continued humming, and Sophie started closing her eyes, almost asleep. "She's sleepy," Zoe whispered. "You're making her sleep," Katie said, softly. "Keep going," Zoe continued humming, and Sophie finally closed her eyes completely. She fell asleep right there in Zoe's lap. Zoe looked at Katie, her eyes shining. "She fell asleep in my lap." "She did," Katie said, "because she feels safe with you." Zoe looked at the sleeping baby, and her face became serious, thoughtful. "Katie," she said after a while. "Saika, sweetie." Zoe hesitated. She looked at Sophie, then at Katie, and then she said, "I wish I had a little sister to play with me." Silence fell in the room. Katie felt the tears well up instantly. She blinked fast, trying to hold them back, but couldn't. A tear rolled down her face. Jonathan, who was standing at the door, felt a pang in his chest. He leaned against the wall, too emotional to speak. Zoe continued looking at Sophie. "She's so nice," Zoe said, her voice soft. "I like her so much. I wish she was my real sister." Katie quickly wiped her tears and approached Zoe. "You love Sophie, don't you?" Zoe nodded. "Very much. I never had anyone to play with. But now I have her." Katie stroked Zoe's blonde hair. "And she has you. You're lucky to have each other." Zoe smiled, still looking at the sleeping Sophie. "I will always take care of her," Zoe said. "Always." Jonathan couldn't hold back anymore. He walked into the room and the two girls looked at him. There were tears in his eyes too. He knelt beside Zoe and looked at his daughter, holding the baby with so much love, so much care. "You would be an amazing sister," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe looked at her father. "You think so?" "I'm sure of it." Zoe smiled. Then she looked at Sophie again and whispered, "I love you, Sophie." The baby was sleeping deeply, but seemed to smile in her sleep. Katie and Jonathan exchanged a look. Both were emotional, touched by the purity of that moment. Zoe had opened up completely. She had found love, connection, purpose, all because of a little blonde baby who had entered her life without warning. And at that moment, as they watched Zoe rocking Sophie with so much affection, Katie and Jonathan felt the same thing. Those two girls had become sisters, maybe not by blood, but by heart. And that was all that mattered. It was almost midnight. The house was silent. Zoe was sleeping in her room, hugging her teddy bear. Sophie was sleeping in the crib next to Katie's room, breathing softly. Katie had just come downstairs to get a glass of water when she saw Jonathan sitting on the sofa in the dark. He was staring into space, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Jonathan," Katie called softly. "Is everything all right?" He turned and tried to smile but couldn't. "Yeah, just thinking." Katie realized that everything was not all right. She could see it in his posture, his slumped shoulders, the way he held the glass. She went to the living room and sat on the sofa, a safe distance away, giving him space. "Want to talk?" Jonathan was silent for a long time. Then he drank the rest of the whiskey and put the glass on the table. When Zoe talked about wanting a sister today, he stopped, his voice failing. It brought back a lot of things. Katie waited, without pressuring him. Jonathan ran his hand over his face. Zoe's mother left when she got the diagnosis. Katie felt her heart sink. She had already guessed there was a story there, but hearing it out loud was different. "How old was she?" Katie asked, gently. 3 years old. Zoe was 3. Jonathan looked at his hands. "We already knew she was different. Zoe didn't talk much, didn't like contact, had meltdowns. But I thought it was just her way, you know. I loved her the way she was." Katie nodded, listening. "But my ex-wife couldn't accept it. She wanted a perfect daughter, a daughter who was like other children. When the autism diagnosis came, it was like her world ended." Jonathan's voice was getting rougher, more choked up. She cried for days, couldn't look at Zoe without getting frustrated. I tried to help, tried to make her understand that Zoe was the same girl, just needed more support, but she wouldn't listen. Katie felt her eyes sting. One day she told me. Jonathan stopped, taking a deep breath. She said she couldn't accept that her daughter was different, that she didn't want that life, that she hadn't signed a contract to be the mother of a special needs child. A tear rolled down Jonathan's face. He wiped it quickly, but more followed. And then she left. She packed her bags, looked at Zoe one last time, and walked out the door. She never came back. Katie was crying too. She couldn't hold it back. "Zoe was 3, Jonathan repeated, his voice completely breaking. She didn't even really understand. She just knew her mother was gone. He covered his face with his hands and started sobbing. It was the first time he had broken down like this, the first time he had let the pain out. Katie didn't hesitate. She moved closer and held his hands, pulling them away from his face. Jonathan looked at her, his face wet with tears. "She didn't leave because of Zoe," Katie said firmly. "It was because of herself." Jonathan shook his head. "But Zoe always thought it was her fault, that she wasn't good enough, that there was something wrong with her. And you were always here saying it wasn't," Katie said, squeezing his hands. "You never abandoned your daughter." Jonathan sobbed again. "But I never knew how to really help her. I tried. Katie, I swear I tried. But I didn't know how to make her feel loved, safe. I watched her close herself off more and more, and I couldn't reach her." Katie held his face with both hands, making him look at her. "Jonathan, listen. You have always loved Zoe. Always. She knows that. She might not show it the way you expect, but she knows. How can you be sure? Because she speaks of you with affection. Because she's happy when you arrive. Because she touches your hand now, and that's huge. She trusts you." Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the tears fall. "I just wanted her to be happy. That's all." "And she is," Katie said. "Don't you see? Zoe is happy now. She plays, she laughs, she connects. And you are part of that. You're learning her language. You're getting closer. You didn't fail, Jonathan. You never failed." Jonathan opened his eyes and looked at Katie. There was so much pain there, but also hope. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you've done for her. For me." Katie smiled, still holding his face. "You both deserve to be happy." Jonathan put his hands over hers, holding them. "You brought life to this house, Katie. You brought hope. I don't know what we'd do without you." Katie felt her heart race. His hands were warm over hers, and there was something in the way he looked at her that made her stomach flip. They stayed like that for a moment, just looking at each other, their hands intertwined. "Zoe loves you," Jonathan said softly. "And I—" He stopped, as if he didn't know if he should continue. Katie waited, her heart pounding. "I thank God every day that you showed up in that garden," he finished. Katie smiled, emotional. I thank God too. You saved me as much as I saved you. Jonathan let go of her hands, but slowly, as if he didn't want to. He wiped the tears from his face and took a deep breath. Sorry for breaking down like that. Don't apologize, Katie said. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to cry. Jonathan nodded. It's been years since I cried like that. Sometimes we need to. They were silent for a few more minutes. It was a comfortable, intimate silence. Katie realized that something had changed between them that night. They had become closer. It wasn't just about Zoe and Sophie anymore. It was about them too. Jonathan looked at her again. You're incredible, Katie. Seriously. Katie felt her face heat up. You too, Jonathan. They smiled at each other, and for the first time, Katie realized how handsome Jonathan was, not just physically but inside, for being a father who loved his daughter unconditionally, for having stayed when others would have left. I think we should get some sleep, Jonathan said, standing up. Katie stood up too. I think so. They walked up the stairs together, in silence. When they reached the hallway, Jonathan stopped in front of his room. Good night, Katie. Good night, Jonathan. He went into the room, but before closing the door, he looked at her one last time. Thank you for listening, for being here. Always, Katie said. Jonathan closed the door, and Katie went to her room. She lay down in bed but couldn't sleep properly. She kept thinking about the conversation, Jonathan's pain, the way he had held her hands, and for the first time since she arrived at that house, Katie felt something that wasn't just gratitude or friendship. It was something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to name yet. But it was there, growing. It was a quiet afternoon. The sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating everything with a soft golden light. Zoe was sitting at the coffee table, surrounded by colored pencils. She was focused, tongue sticking out, drawing carefully. She had been there for almost an hour, working on the same drawing. Katie was on the rug with Sophie. The baby had just turned one and was trying to take her first steps. Katie held her little hands, helping her balance. That's it, come on, Sophie. You can do it. Sophie took shaky steps, her legs wobbly, but she was trying. She let out a giggle every time she managed to take a step without falling. Jonathan was on the sofa, laptop on his lap, trying to work, but he couldn't concentrate. He kept looking at the scene in front of him. Katie and Sophie playing, Zoe drawing, his house full of life, laughter, happiness. He still couldn't believe his luck. Done, Zoe suddenly said, holding up the paper. Katie looked at her. Finished? Zoe nodded, excited. She looked at the drawing, then at Jonathan. Daddy, come see. Jonathan closed his laptop and went to the table. He crouched down beside his daughter. What did you draw? Zoe turned the paper towards him. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. It was a drawing of 4 people. He recognized each one instantly. A tall man with dark hair, himself, a small blonde girl, smiling, Zoe, a woman with long hair, holding a baby on her lap, Katie and Sophie. The 4 were holding hands. Behind them, an enormous Christmas tree, full of colorful ornaments and twinkling lights. And above everything, in large odd-colored letters, was written, My Family. Jonathan couldn't speak. He just stared at the drawing, feeling his chest tighten more and more. Katie had stood up and approached, with Sophie in her arms. When she saw the drawing, she covered her mouth with her hand. Zoe, Katie whispered. Zoe looked at her father, awaiting his reaction. Do you like it, Daddy? Jonathan took the drawing with trembling hands. He looked at every detail, the way Zoe had drawn everyone smiling, the way she had put them all holding hands, the way she had written, My Family, with such care. It's beautiful, Jonathan said, his voice failing. It's the most beautiful drawing I've ever seen. Zoe smiled, proud. It's us, she said, pointing to each person. You, me, Katie, and Sophie. Jonathan nodded, unable to take his eyes off the paper. Our family, Zoe said simply. Katie was crying silently. She hugged Sophie to her chest, trying to control her emotion. Zoe was silent for a moment, looking at the drawing. Then she looked at her father, and there was something different in her eyes. Something serious, deep. "Daddy," she said softly. "Yes, sweetie." Zoe hesitated. She looked at Katie, who was standing beside them. Then she looked back at Jonathan. "Katie could be my mom." Silence fell in the room like a bomb. Jonathan froze. He stood still, holding the drawing, processing what he had just heard. Katie was speechless. She stopped breathing for a second, just looking at Zoe with wide eyes. Sophie, not understanding anything, just babbled something and tried to grab the drawing. Zoe continued looking at her father, waiting for an answer. She didn't look nervous or embarrassed. She had said it with all the sincerity in the world. Jonathan dropped the drawing on the table and knelt in front of his daughter. "Zoe, you know what you just said?" Zoe nodded. "I do. I want Katie to be my mum." Jonathan felt the tears well up. He looked at Katie, who was also crying, holding Sophie tightly. "Why, sweetie?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "Why do you want that?" Zoe looked at Katie, and the love in her eyes was so pure, so genuine, that it broke everyone's heart there. "Because she takes care of me," Zoe said. "She helps me when I'm scared. She plays with me. She teaches me things. She hugs me." Tears streamed down Jonathan's face now. "And she makes me happy," Zoe continued. "I was never happy before Katie came, but now I am, and Sophie is my sister too. I love her." Katie couldn't hold it back anymore. She started sobbing, covering her face with one hand while holding Sophie with the other. Zoe got down from the chair and went to Katie. She hugged her legs, squeezing tightly. "Don't you want to be my mom?" Zoe asked, looking up. Katie knelt down, still holding Sophie, and was at Zoe's height. "Zoe, She couldn't continue. The words wouldn't come out. "Don't you like me?" Zoe asked, and there was fear in her voice now. "No," Katie said quickly, carefully putting Sophie down on the floor and taking Zoe's face in both hands. "I love you, Zoe. I love you so much." "Then why can't you be my mum?" Katie looked at Jonathan, desperate, not knowing what to say. Jonathan was devastated. He saw his daughter asking for a complete family, asking for a mother. And it wasn't just any mother, it was Katie, the woman who had saved both of them, the woman who had brought light into their lives, the woman he had fallen in love with without realizing it. He stood up and went to the two of them. He knelt beside Katie and placed his hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Sweetie, it's complicated," he said, not knowing how to explain. "Why?" Zoe asked. "Do you like Katie?" Jonathan looked at Katie. She was looking back at him, her eyes full of tears, waiting for his answer. Jonathan took a deep breath. "Yes, I like Katie." Katie's eyes widened. "And she likes you," Zoe said, as if it were obvious. "And I like her. And Sophie too. So why can't we be a real family?" Jonathan had no answer, because deep down, he wanted exactly that. He wanted Katie to be part of his family. He wanted to wake up every day and see her there. He wanted Zoe to have the mother she deserved. He wanted Sophie to have a father. He wanted Katie. But he was afraid of ruining everything, afraid of not being enough, afraid of losing her. Katie wiped her tears and held Zoe's hands. "Zoe, sweetie, these things take time. It's not that simple." "Why?" Zoe insisted. "You live here. You take care of me. You're already like a mom. Why can't you be real?" Katie had no answer for that, because Zoe was right. She already did everything a mother would do. She already loved Zoe as if she were her own daughter, and she loved Jonathan too. She had realized it in the last few weeks, in the way he looked at her, in the way he held her hand when they were talking, in the way he smiled when she walked into the room. She had fallen in love with him, and with Zoe, and with that broken family she had helped fix. Zoe looked at the two adults, waiting. Sophie started whimpering on the floor, and Katie mechanically picked her back up. "Can we think about it?" Jonathan finally said. "Can we?" Zoe was silent, thinking. Then she nodded. "Okay. But I want Katie to be my mum. I really want it." She hugged Katie again, squeezing tightly. Katie returned the hug, kissing the top of her blonde head. Jonathan stood there, watching the two of them, and in that moment, he made a decision. He wasn't going to lose this. He wasn't going to lose them. He was going to fight for this family because that's what they were. A family. And Zoe had just voiced what they all had been feeling for a long time. After the conversation about the drawing, something changed between Jonathan and Katie. They didn't talk directly about what Zoe had said, but it was there, present in every look, in every gesture. Jonathan started coming home earlier from work. He cancelled meetings, delegated tasks. He wanted to be home with them. He wanted to have dinner together, hear about Zoe's day, watch Sophie take her first steps. He wanted to be close to Katie. They started talking more. One evening, while Zoe watched cartoons, Jonathan and Katie prepared dinner together. He chopped vegetables while she seasoned the chicken. "Did you always want to work with children?" Jonathan asked. Katie smiled. "Always. Since I was little, I knew I wanted to make a difference in someone's life." "You do," Jonathan said, looking at her. "You make a huge difference." Katie felt her face warm. She stirred the pot, trying to hide her reaction. They continued cooking side by side, their arms brushing occasionally. It was natural, comfortable, as if they had always done that together. At dinner, the four of them sat at the table. Zoe talked about her drawings. Sophie drooled in her high chair, and Jonathan and Katie exchanged glances that lasted a second longer than they should. Jonathan started helping with Sophie. He gave her baths, changed diapers, prepared bottles. The baby became attached to him. She reached out her little arms when she saw him, wanting to be held. One night, Katie came downstairs for water and found Jonathan walking around the living room with Sophie, humming softly. The baby was sleeping on his shoulder. "She didn't want to sleep," he explained, a little awkwardly. "You're good at this," Katie said. "I learned from the best." They smiled, and something passed between them. Something warm, genuine. Zoe noticed everything and didn't miss an opportunity to bring the two together. When Jonathan arrived, she ran to him. "Daddy, come see what Katie made." And she pulled his hand to where Katie was. When Katie sat on the sofa, Zoe pulled her father. "Sit here, Daddy." Next to Katie. Jonathan obeyed, laughing, and sat so close that their legs touched. One afternoon, Zoe asked for help with a drawing. "Katie, color this side. Daddy, do the other." They leaned forward, and their faces were close, very close. Katie felt Jonathan's breath. She turned and found him looking at her. For 3 seconds, the world stopped. Then Zoe spoke. "It's beautiful." They moved away, laughing nervously, and Zoe smiled, satisfied. The silences between them became comfortable. Jonathan read on the sofa while Katie fed Sophie. Zoe drew on the rug. No one spoke, but there was peace. Katie looked at him sometimes and caught him looking back. They smiled and went back to what they were doing. The feeling grew every day. It was on a Thursday night that everything changed. At bedtime, Zoe asked, "I want Daddy and Katie to read together." They went up to her room. Jonathan sat on one side of the bed, Katie on the other, with Sophie almost asleep on her lap. Jonathan started reading. Katie chimed in during the pauses. Zoe listened, her eyes heavy. When he finished, Zoe was already asleep. She turned and leaned against Katie, hugging Sophie too. Jonathan stood up, grabbed the blanket, and covered all three of them carefully. When he finished, he stood there, looking at Katie. She looked back. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, closer. He reached out and touched her face, gently. "Katie," he whispered. "Jonathan, I'm in love with you," Katie felt the tears well up. "Me too, I'm in love with you." Jonathan smiled and leaned in slowly. Katie did the same, being careful not to wake the girls. Their lips met. It was soft, delicate, full of promises. When they pulled away, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. "I want us to be a real family." "I want that too," Katie said, crying and smiling. They stayed like that, just looking at each other, while Zoe and Sophie slept between them. Their family was complete. The months flew by. Jonathan proposed to Katie in the garden, near the tree where everything began. Zoe held Sophie, and both screamed when Katie said yes. The wedding was simple, just the four of them and a few friends. Zoe was the flower girl, carrying the rings with pride. And then December came again. It was Christmas Eve. 1 year since Katie appeared in that garden, without hope. Now she laughed as Jonathan wrestled with the Christmas lights. "I put them away neatly," he grumbled. Katie took them from his hands. "Let me handle it." Zoe skipped around the garden in a red hat. Sophie tried to run after her, falling and getting back up. They started decorating the tree together, the same tree where it all started. Jonathan held the ladder. Katie placed the high ornaments. Zoe handed him the balls. Sophie played with the bows on the ground. When only the star was left, Jonathan picked Zoe up and held her high. She placed the golden star on top. "Done!" The four of them took a step back. The tree sparkled. Twinkling lights, swaying ornaments, the star illuminating everything. Zoe stared at it. Then she turned to Katie and held her hand. "Now you're my mum," she said, simply, for real. Katie knelt down and hugged her daughter, crying, "I am my love, forever." Jonathan approached from behind and hugged the two of them. Sophie crawled to them, wanting to be part of it. Jonathan picked her up and placed her in the middle of the hug. He hugged Katie from behind and whispered, "We are a family." Katie turned and kissed him. "We are." Sophie clapped her hands and giggled. Zoe squeezed Katie tighter, never wanting to let go. They stood hugging under the tree as the snow began to fall. The garden was lit up. The fountain sparkled. The house was full of warmth and life. The Christmas tree shone just like a year ago, but now with much more meaning. A family of four was embracing there, laughing. Happy, complete, a family born of love and kindness. Jonathan looked at Katie. She looked back. They didn't need words. Zoe held both their hands. "Thank you for coming back," she said to Katie. "For staying." Katie kissed her forehead. "I would always come back." The snow fell gently. Sophie tried to catch the flakes. Zoe looked up at the sky and smiled. "Ah, it's perfect." And it was. The house was no longer silent. It was full of laughter, conversations, life. And as the snow fell and the lights twinkled, that family knew they had found what mattered most. Love, belonging, home. Jonathan pulled Katie closer. Zoe nestled between them. Sophie laughed in her father's arms. The tree sparkled behind them, illuminating not just the garden, but the hearts of everyone there. They had found each other unexpectedly. A mother without a home, a lost father, a lonely girl, an innocent baby. And now they were a family, complete, happy, united. The snow kept falling, covering the garden with a white blanket. The lights twinkled softly. And on that Christmas night, under that tree where it all began, four hearts beat as one, because love had won, kindness had triumphed, and a family that shouldn't exist had become the most real of all. Katie looked at the starry sky and gave thanks. She thanked God for stopping in that garden, for helping that girl, for being brave enough to accept help when she needed it. Jonathan kissed the top of her head and squeezed tighter. Zoe whispered, "I love you," so softly that it almost got lost in the wind. And Sophie, in the arms of the father who had loved her as his own since the beginning, closed her eyes and slept with a smile on her face. The story that began with pain, cold and loneliness ended with warmth, love and family, and they lived happily ever after.